God bless, guys. Today, I just want to talk about a little bit of the things that I've been studying just for fun. And really, I just want to talk about one thing in particular that has really caught my attention that I do want to get closer to and really look into myself. And it's the concept of idol worship in the way that it's seen biblically, more than just a thing of the Old Testament, but a thing that supersedes a lot of thoughts that I never really considered before, such as looking into the sin of Adam and Eve as a form of idol worship versus as a sin against God, and how they, in the act of replacing themselves with God, made themselves to be an idol before God. Also, just the way that idols really do affect our lives, and how the biblical language really does change when a person worships an idol, and the way the biblical authors go through and change the language just based off of the things that they're worshiping and how those idols took over their lives. It really all just stems from me from a book that I read by G.K. Beale called We Become What We Worship. And in it, he goes through the Old Testament and the New Testament, highlighting how idol worship is something that actually alters the person who is worshiping the idol. That the attributes that the idol has becomes what the person actually is in the way that God sees them, in the way that they worship, and the way that they communicate and live their lives. So when the title says we become what we worship, it's an indication that the object in which we worship becomes who we are, and that we represent the idols that we worship, not just in our sins, but in every aspect of our lives. It really is something that changes you when you put something above God in your life. And I just found how easy it was to live a life where idols become a part of who you are. Just seeing how in the Old Testament it was clearly shown that idol worship actually changed the culture of the people that were there and that they didn't want to see God because they were too afraid because they lived too long worshiping idols. And so honestly, it's one of those topics that for me was just eye-opening. Of course, it doesn't mean that I agree fully with it or that this is the best biblical example that we have, but it is something that caught my attention and something that I've been meaning to look closer into because I read this book. Now, within it, all the author really does is highlight the connection between the vocabulary and how people are seen within worship within the Old Testament when idols are involved. In particular, calf worship, how after Israel and the people of God worship calves, how then the language changes and then they're referred to as stiff-necked like the calves that they worship. And it really just the whole language indicates that the decisions that they make, the life that they're choosing, and the things that they follow are because they worship that idol. They reflect that. And then within the New Testament, it focuses on how we show the attributes of the things that take priority in our hearts. And we do see a lot within the New Testament a hyper focus on making sure that our worship and our hearts are centered on God. And that when we worship God, we become like God. We get closer to Him. And some of the things that really stood out to me is just one of the biggest forms of idol worship is when we ourselves try to become God in our lives. When we try to take that place of God, and then we become the thing that deserves the worship in our eyes. And when we do such a thing, we're thinking that we're making ourselves greater because we're getting closer to being like God. But the reality is that we become smaller because the moment that we try to worship ourselves, we will never measure up to the perfection, the glory, or the fullness of who God is. And so when we worship an idol of ourselves, we become smaller. But when we worship the true and living God, we become greater because now we share in that glory of God. Because if we become what we worship, and we become like God in our worship, not like God in the sense that we share the attributes of God, but like God in the sense that we live in holiness before Him, that we live righteous before Him, that we live a life that is worthy of representing who God is, as Paul likes to say, live in a manner worthy of the calling which you've been called, and many other passages that Paul indicates in that manner. We just see that the closer we get to God within our worship, the better the attributes we have that reflect God in our lives. And so it was just a reminder to me to view my life not just in the light of have I sinned today, but also remember who have I worshiped today? Is my life a reflection of my worship to God? Or is my life a reflection of my worship of idols or of all the different things in the world? Or have I put myself above God in my desire to be worshiped as well? Anyways, these are just some thoughts that I have, but thank you so much for listening. God bless. And if you like the content that we're providing, feel free to subscribe for more content like this.